Thank you so much for joining us for this third live webinar in our 10-part series, which has just actually become 12. I'm delighted to announce that we've added 2 more topics to the programme, which will take us well into 2025. We've added vetting for the education and for the health and social care sectors to the webinar programme. But today, I'm delighted to be joined by our very own Sarah Crane. She's a wonderful screening veteran, despite her youthful appearance. We're looking to raise awareness around best practice in BS7858 screening. How are you doing, Sarah? You ready for this?
Yeah, I'm good. Ready and raring to go.
Fantastic. So, navigating BS7858. Let's quickly just run through what we're going to be covering today. To kick things off, here's a quick reminder that 7858 is no longer just the realm of the UK security sector. In fact, many organisations across multiple industries have adopted 7858 as their de facto baseline for employment screening purposes. And for that reason, not all of the requirements that specifically apply to firms within the SIA's approved contractor scheme will be applicable to everyone, so just bear that in mind. Some of you may be wondering why we're covering a vetting standard that hasn't changed for several years, but while the requirements haven't changed since they were introduced in 2020, there's still a lot of debate and confusion around the standard. So we'll be covering off the requirements, the challenges, and some industry best practices that can make the job a little easier for employers. As always, we'll be starting with a bit of background around the standard. We'll provide an overview of what's now included and then dive into some of the key requirements. We're going to talk about how to stay compliant. We'll give solutions for some of the challenges. And as usual, if you've attended our previous webinars, there will be some polls throughout the webinar to gauge some understanding and awareness. Now, please feel free to post any questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A tab. We'll answer as many questions as we can during the session at the end of the webinar. Now, let us just kick things off with a quick poll.
So how familiar are you with the BS7858 2019 standard? So we just want to gauge some understanding. So are you very familiar, somewhat familiar, not familiar at all, or what is it?
Let's just see, we've got some answers coming in there. As you'd expect, a lot of you are here because you're not familiar with 7858 or just somewhat familiar, which is great. You're exactly the people that we want to be talking to. So the background, what is 7858 and why are we talking about it today? Well, BS7858 sets out the standard for the security screening of staff in an environment where the safety of people, goods or property is essential. And a bit of history, security vetting was actually born back in the UK in 1991, and I think we can all be forgiven for not knowing much about BS7499 though, as this was replaced by 7858 in 1996. 7858 has had 5 revisions since 96 though, and we're currently working off version 6, which came into effect in March 2020, not in 2019 as the name would suggest. But unfortunately it was released just at the start of the pandemic, before vetting and screening industry was dramatically shaken up. There's a lot that's not covered that I think otherwise would have been. But that said, despite the status currently showing as under review, I have it on very good authority that the 7858 committee is not currently sitting to revise this current standard. So everything that we discussed today, I'm confident will be relevant for at least the next year or so at the very least. One of the changes that was released in 2019 was actually the introduction of the vetting standard for purposes outside of the traditional security sector. The UK private security sector plays a crucial role in complementing the work of the police by providing professional and dependable security service, and it covers a wide range of services, things like cash in transit, door supervision, CCTV, security guarding, key holding and vehicle immobilization. But it's also worth pointing out that the mission of private security companies is essentially to support the Home Office priorities of reducing terrorism, preventing and tackling crime, and ensuring people feel safe in their homes and communities. So in short, everybody benefits from BS7858 vetting. BS7858 offers a comprehensive framework for ensuring effective screening processes, which is critical in enhancing trustworthiness of individuals in all manner of sensitive roles. One of the primary objectives of 7858 is to safeguard against insider threats of all manner, and by thoroughly vetting employees, we mitigate risks that could arise from within an organisation, which is particularly important in roles where individuals have access to sensitive information or valuable assets. And the screening process defined in 7858 help build a workforce that's not only reliable but resilient against potential compromises too. And beyond mitigating risks, Adhering to the 7858 standard is essential for complying with regulatory requirements, and as security threats evolve, it's the duty of the regulatory bodies that update their guidelines to ensure organisations remain vigilant and proactive in their security measures. Now, the idea is that compliance with 7858 demonstrates a commitment to maintaining high standards and adhering to industry best practices. Now, the overarching goals of 7858 align closely with the core mission of the private security sector, which is safeguarding people, property and assets. By effectively implementing screening process, this contributes significantly to crime prevention and allows organisations to identify and address potential threats before they materialise, and it ensures a safer environment for us all. Now, in addition to crime prevention, 7858 plays a critical role in risk management. By conducting background checks, organisations can better understand the risk profile of their workforce. They take protective and proactive measures to assess any vulnerabilities. And this proactive approach also enhances security and builds trust within clients and stakeholders. So that's one of the prime reasons for adopting 7858, vetting outside the security sector. But as you can see, my final point here is that an important but much overlooked consideration of 7858 vetting is the protection of insurance cover. Insurance companies often require evidence of providing security measures, including effective vetting, to provide their insurance coverage. So by adhering to 7858, organisations ensure that they meet these requirements, maintaining their insurance cover and safeguarding financial interests. So it's more than a standard, it's a cornerstone of effective security management in the private sector. And then by ensuring the trustworthiness of individuals, mitigating insider threats and complying with regulatory requirements, we can create a safer and more secure environment for everyone. So I'm just going to launch another poll here.
Question time. Who regulates BS785 vetting? It's no longer answers on a postcard. Let's see how many of you know the answer.
Love to see. We've got a nice variety, a wide spread of response. Nobody thinks it's the Home Office and nobody believes it was the MI5 either, which is fantastic to hear. The requirements for 7858 vetting are regulated by the British Standards Institution, the BSI. I saw a few votes here for the Security Industry Authority. Well, their role is actually to oversee the implementation of the standards within the security sector in the UK. So while the SIA does not directly regulate the 7858 standard, compliance with 7858 is a regulatory requirement for organisations that wish to join the SIA's Approved Contractor Scheme, or ACS. This means that while 7858 is not legally mandated by the SIA, it is essential for companies aiming to achieve or maintain their ACS status. And for anybody who went with the NSI, the National Security Inspectorate, they also truly play a crucial role in the implementation and maintenance of the 7858 vetting standard. Its roles, though, mainly involve accreditation and approval, training, guidance, and all things auditing and compliance to maintain these standards. The NSI is also a great source of resources and support, and you can find those on the NSI website too. Sarah, over to you.
So what does BS7858 involve? At a headline level, it's covering public record information, which is also known as credit checks. So pre-employment credit checks started gaining traction in the UK in the late 1990s. Initially, they were being used for roles involving financial responsibilities or access to sensitive financial information. But over time, their use has expanded to a wider range of positions as employers recognise the value of assessing a candidate's financial reliability and responsibility. However, the term credit check is a bit of a misnomer. So employment credit checks in the UK involve reviewing publicly available information about an individual's financial history. This can include details such as CCJs or county court judgment, bankruptcies and IVAs or individual voluntary arrangements. So employers can only access data from the edited version of the electoral roll, and these checks help employers assess the financial reliability and responsibility of potential employees without sharing data which is only accessible to lenders. They leave a soft footprint which have no effect on the individual's credit rating, and that's what we mean when we say credit checks in the industry. The BS7858 standard correctly specifies that these are not technically credit checks. And then you have your right to work, your identity verification, criminal records, employment history checks, and your sanctions as well.
Let's move on for now. I'm going to talk you through the different types of BS7858. It's crucial for securing employment within the private sector. It can be a little bit confusing, but in terms of 7858 vetting, firstly, we've got limited screening, which allows for conditional employment to commence. This means that employers can provisionally engage someone to work provided limited screening is completed, provided any identified risks have been evaluated and documented. Now, preliminary checks are not a level of 7858 vetting, but they do form the bedrock of the process. So limited screening allows for conditional employment to commence. It means that employers can engage someone to work once their preliminary checks and limited screening have been completed, provided any identified risks have been evaluated and documented. So the preliminary checks, this is a crucial bit. They're not a level of 7858 vetting, but they do form the bedrock of the process. They include creating a vetting file that's capable of monitoring progress in compliance with 27001 standards. And of course, our EBC Global Vetting platform is, of course, ideal for doing just that. Capturing all of the necessary candidate data and obtaining their consent, including a signed authority form. There's also a very obvious requirement to conduct robust ID check using photographic ID documents wherever possible. And we can, of course, help with digital ID verification and right to work checks, which are integrated directly into the EBC platform. Now, collecting personal information, this includes the 5-year address history and employment activity as well, including all GACs. This is all part of the preliminary checks phase. And it's also vital that candidates are provided with an opportunity to declare any adverse financial information, such as bankruptcies or CCJs, before the public record information check is run. So speaking of which, please note that any CCJs over £10,000, any bankruptcies or conflicts of interest require top management to complete and sign an acceptance of risk form. And templates of everything that employers require for 7858 vetting, including the acceptance of risk forms, are available as an annex within the BSI document. So if you don't have a copy already, do make sure you get hold of one of those as well, although it does cost a few £100s. So then, conducting the essential background checks, such as the SIA register check for those who are license holders with the SIA, and also conducting a global watch list check for sanctions and PEPs. PEPs being politically exposed persons, and this requirement for sanctions checks was introduced as a new mandatory requirement in the current version back in 2019-2020. Now, previously they were only recommended rather than required, so hopefully the same will apply to open source internet, also known as social media checks, because they were introduced as a recommendation in 2019 too, and hopefully they'll also move it into a requirement in the next iteration of the 7858 standard. So then, to complete limited screening, and this would allow candidates to work pending full screening, and this is really crucial to allow firms to recruit for roles in security and event management. As you can imagine, you just need to obtain confirmation or documentary evidence of at least 3 years employment activity. So it's 3 years, not 5, for the limited screening. And the transition to top up from limited to full screening, employers just need to have a full 5-year activity period verified or evidenced before the maximum allowed period of 12 weeks for vetting ends. You can actually have up to 16 weeks though for a 10-year vetting period. If you've got any questions, do pop them in the Q&A tab and we'll pick them up at the end. Now we're just going to launch another poll here. So poll number 3 is:
so which aspects of BS7858 2019 will you find the most challenging? So you can move these around to rank them in order. So we've got right to work checks, public information records, aka credit checks, ID verification, UK criminal records, employment history /3 activity verification, open source internet, global sanctions and watch list, and directorship checks.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
So, ID and right to work checks. So it's crucial to get this right. There's no point vetting anyone or proceeding with their employment unless you're as certain as you can be about their identity. Not to mention the risk of receiving up to a £60,000 fine for hiring each illegal worker. So ID verification. So the requirements for ID checks follow the current DBS ID checking guidelines. This means that digital IDVT checks are acceptable, or you have to adopt the guidelines for a manual identity document check instead. An address verification, which is something that many firms fail to comply with correctly, but it's actually an integral part of the BS7858 vetting process. So here are the guidelines, are identical to the BPSS requirements, or at least they were until they were updated a few months ago. So basically, if current address is not shown on the electoral roll when conducting the online public record information check, aka credit check, then you need to be obtaining a recent utility bill, financial statement, or similar from the candidate to keep on their vetting file to confirm that that is their current address. So when it comes to right to work, as for all UK employers, there's now 3 options for conducting right to work checks. There's the physical check, which is a manual face-to-face document check, the digital checking service for British and Irish citizens, and the share code for non-British or Irish citizens. So employers can benefit greatly from digital right to work checks instead of physical document inspection. You still need to cross-reference the details of any electronic checks with information provided by the candidate, and most importantly, employers must complete an imposter check to obtain a statutory excuse against civil penalty. So does the output of the digital right to work check match the person person being hired for the role. So you can confirm that yes, the passport's valid, but you need to make sure that that matches the person as well. Identity fraud continues to be rife within the security sector, especially when these checks are not conducted effectively. Now back to DC for more guidance on how to comply with BS7858.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So starting with criminal records. Now, for licensed roles, criminal record checks are actually conducted directly by the SIA. For all other roles, employers are responsible for carrying out their own checks to the highest legally available level. It's important to note that international criminal record checks are not currently a requirement for 7858 vetting. Very similar to the pre-2024 version of the baseline personnel security standard requirements, or BPSS vetting, which were just updated. And in such cases, employers are required to obtain work references or documentary evidence as a minimum standard for periods outside of the UK. That doesn't mean don't do criminal record checks for people who've worked outside the UK in the period. It just means that they're not specifically required in the current standard. So moving on to employment verification referencing. Now, this is the biggest challenge for most employers. It's required to cover a minimum of 5 years, and all gaps of 31 days or more, including periods of time spent overseas, must be evidenced with appropriate documents and explanations. Now, acceptable proof of employment includes national insurance or HMRC PAYE records or pay records, and if these are not available, then 2 forms of suitable evidence must be collected. Now, to be clear, potential evidence could be 2 or more items from pay slips that show the start and finish of a period of employment, P60s for each year, P45s showing the date of leaving, redundancy letters, contracts of employment, or bank statements showing regular payment of wages or salary. For those using open banking to show payment of wages, then another piece of evidence will still be required. Self-employment, that can be evidenced by documentation from HMRC, self-assessment, accountants, bankers, or trade references too. But ultimately, in cases where you're just unable to get the verifications that you require, a statutory declaration may be used for a maximum of 2 periods that don't exceed 6 months in total. So it can be 1 period of up to 6 months or 2 periods not exceeding 6 months in total. But do note that these statutory declarations must be made before a solicitor, a commission of oaths, a notary public, or a justice of the peace by the individual being screened. Nothing else is acceptable. And last but not least, document and electronic data checking. It's crucial for organisations to retain the evidence of all electronic checks being completed. Alternatively, keep a record of who conducted the checks of the original documents, and this ensures that there's a clear trail of accountability and compliance with the BS7858 standard. For all other document and data checks, employers must keep suitable evidence of each of the checks having been completed. So very quickly, let's just run through these 3 final considerations around requirements for 784, requirements recommendations for 7858 vetting. It's rarely an issue, but if you do screen for 10 years instead of the minimum 5-year period, you actually have a 16-week window to complete the vetting instead of 12 weeks for the 5. Social media or open source checks, these are without any doubt the most powerful background checks currently available on the market, and I urge you to neglect these at your peril. They'll identify publicly available risk factors and character flaws that other checks simply cannot detect. And if we can find content that would cause concern, then so could an investigator or journalist who would have no qualms about using the information to bring the individual or your organisation into disrepute. So it's better to know what information is available online about your employees before you find out in the media. And finally, directorship checks. Now, this is a strange one because 7858 actually requires top management to sign acceptance of risk for individuals who were a director of another organisation. Obviously, you need to check for directorships in order to know whether or not sign-off is required or not. You can't rely on candidates to tell you the truth all the time, otherwise there would simply be no need for employment vetting. Very interestingly, the pandemic and working from home and the cost of living crisis combined has all led to a huge surge in the number of people setting up side hustles. It's not just senior directors that require directorships checks these days, because conflict of interest now applies to employees at all levels. So jumping into implementation and compliance, making any adjustments perhaps that you need to apply to your own 7858 vetting process. Now, ensure that data data isn't kept in line with ISO 27001 and BS 7799-3 requirements. Could be new one to you, especially the 77993 iteration, but it's all about keeping data secure, particularly when electronic records are in play, as most firms will be using them these days as well. An obvious requirement is obviously to respect the Data Protection Act and GDPR requirements to prevent unauthorized access to vetting files. I've already mentioned that 7858 vetting needs to be completed within 12 weeks of conditional employment commencing, or 16 for those 10-year periods. And obviously do not let visas expire before rechecks are completed for anybody you're employing without indefinite leave to remain in the UK. Now, a couple of ones that you might not be familiar with: files that were unsuccessful at preliminary screening. So people that you've eliminated from recruitment at the preliminary screening stage, you still got to keep the records for a minimum of 12 months. There's a whole wide variety of reasons for this. You need to know that those records do need to be retained. And screening files and evidence of all checks that are being completed must be kept for 7 years post-employment, with the exception of criminal record checks, which obviously have to be destroyed in line with data storage and handling policies for whichever issuing body you've got them from, whether it's from Disclosure Scotland, the Disclosure and Barring Service for England and Wales, or Access Northern Ireland. Now, when it comes to training, this is offered by the NSI as an e-learning course and several other independent companies. So training is available for you and your vetting teams to completely familiarize yourselves with the standards. This is not a training course. This is very much an awareness webinar. Obviously, outsourcing may be outsourced to specialist providers. The caveat is that you have to make sure that there are appropriate risk assessments and record keeping in place. This should involve regular audit and review of files, and of course the ethical considerations as well. So you've got to make sure that you've got a policy in place that prevents any discrimination, ensures fairness and transparency, and takes into account the crucial Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. So tips and best practices, there are just 3 things that we really strongly advise. These are things that you could and perhaps should be doing. So touched on this already, but having an HR policy for employment screening. Doesn't matter who you are or what your business is, I always recommend having a robust employment screening policy in place, whether that's for pre-employment checks or ongoing staff vetting. It all needs to be wrapped in there, along with all of your hiring decisions requirements as well. And do, as I say, get your own copy of BS7858 standards. It needs to be your Bible if 7858 vetting is part and parcel of your recruitment process. I do strongly urge organisations to embrace digital identity verifications, both for just identity checks in general, but also for right to work checks. A vast majority of people working in the UK are able to go through online digital identity verification and receive a right to work. As Sarah mentioned earlier, as long as you've done the imposter check at the end of the process, you've got your statutory excuse without having to meet the individuals face to face in person. And of course, another key benefit is the results are essentially immediately available. Now, the final piece is, I think, employment history verifications using instant HMRC records can really transform your employment screening process, really fast track the vetting. And if you obtain it early enough in the process, you can identify any gaps, any issues before they arise as the results from referencing in the traditional manner would deliver. And really, for best practice, depending on your requirements, you might need to think about things like DVLA checks. It's a service we're going to be launching very, very soon here at EBC. Directorships we've already talked about, checking companies' house to ensure that your employee doesn't have a side hustle or an external interest which could represent a conflict of interest. And of course, social media checks. I've already talked about those in some detail, but it is there already as a recommended check for certain roles in the current 7858 standard. So the final poll.
So this is a question we asked in the BPSS webinar as well. So really want to understand your outlook on instant HMRC employment history verifications. So how does the concept of accepting HMRC employment history verifications for BS7858 vetting make you feel? So we know there's sometimes some uncertainty and some worry around it. So if you've got anything you want to share, then please enter now.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Now, a quick recap of what we've already discussed. And if you understand all of these points and implications, you'll be in a really good place. Please feel free to get any final questions using the Q&A tab now, or reach out to us directly after the webinar. So know what you need for compliance with both limited and conditional vetting, understand the difference between the two and what the requirements are, understand understand the importance of those preliminary checks too. Be aware of those timescales, the difference between completing full vetting for the 5-year and 10-year periods. Crucial bit is the requirements for collecting evidence. What will the NSI accept when it comes to audit, for example? What are the SIA expecting of you? What the BSI requirements actually stipulate? It's all there in black and white in that 7858 Bible, so no excuses for not knowing what to do, really. Now, the importance of good record keeping. We covered this in a couple of slides previously, but the importance of retaining those files for 7 years post-employment is crucial, and of course of retaining records of people who have been eliminated at the preliminary stage for 12 years once that decision has been made too. And of course, how and when to use the acceptance of risk form and the declarations as well. There's a link here in the deck. Obviously, this deck will be available to you after the webinar. We'll be sending out emails to all of you who have attended with a breakdown of the contents as well. So no need to try and copy this just now. So now we come to questions from the floor. Yep, some good questions here. The first one was, how often should we update our 7-8 screening procedures? Well, I honestly recommend that you review your procedures at least annually, but also whenever there are any significant changes in regulations or industry best practices. So if you bear in mind there were 7 years between the 2012 and 2019 standards being released, and there's already been 5 years since the standard was last finalized, and there have been an awful lot of change, significant changes since that time, as I mentioned earlier. You know, the introduction of digital identity verifications, digital right to work checks, or these have had a major impact on some of the elements of the 7858 screening, and whilst they're not addressed in the standard itself, you can still implement these as best practices, particularly when they are related to the DBS identity checking requirements, which have been updated in the interim period. And in fact, the whole background checking landscape has been evolving at record pace. I've never experienced this in the 20 odd years that I've been working in background checks, and there are new checks, new tools emerging all the time. So regular updates ensure not only compliance with the vetting standards, but also the effectiveness of your own vetting process. You're not doing this just as a tick box exercise, you're doing it for risk mitigation. I urge you to keep that front and center of your thinking. So in short, there's no need to wait for 7-8 requirements to change before you complement the existing process with new and best practice solutions. But as long as you do maintain those core requirements in line with existing requirements, so as long as you're addressing the core requirements compliantly. So question 2, is there a faster way to collect BS7858 gaps in employment? Yeah, this is a real challenge for a lot of organizations. Another great question. The best way, I think, is undoubtedly to use the HMRC pay employment history at the outset of each vetting, just to identify what gap periods do exist from the official records. I say this because if you use HMRC checks as a last resort, there are all sorts of gremlins that can be unearthed, which would actually invalidate the other references and the checks that you've done. For example, dates that didn't match with candidate documents that have been provided for whatever reason, hidden periods of employment, and even differences between the name of the organization that you see on a reference versus what you'll see on the HMRC records. These are all considerations that you really would benefit from finding out up front rather than waiting to the end of the vetting. So it does avoid an awful lot of extra work if you know what you're dealing with on day one. Another tactic, if you don't want to use the HMRC route, is to get the candidates to provide suitable evidence for all activity, including gaps, at the outset too. I know a lot of companies do this already, and it can speed up, well, it does speed up the overall turnaround times in a lot of cases, but unfortunately causes a lot of unnecessary extra work for everybody who has to go through the process, and often leads to a less than happy candidate experience for everyone. Why subject the majority of people through one process when it's only a smaller percentage of the people who will need to provide everything for their 7858 vetting? So yeah, those are the two options for me. Document collection very, very early in the process, or using HMRC employment verification instead at the outset. So unless there are any more questions, there's just one more that I've seen. Is BS7858 the same as BPSS? Well, I get where you're coming from, but no, 7858 and BPSS are not the same, although they do share a lot of similarities, particularly around ID checking and evidencing activity in particular. The guidelines are almost identical, or at least they were until they were changed for BPSS a couple of months ago. BS7858 is a security standard standard. It was initially specifically designed for the private security industry, whereas BPSS was designed for the public sector. 7858 involves all of the requirements of BPS with a few extra checks on top, actually. It's the international sanctions and watch list checks and what we used to call credit checks, but the public information record checks according to the 7858 standard. These are now mandatory requirements which don't exist in BPSS vetting. The other key difference, of course, is that there's a 5-year activity period that needs to be verified for 7858 or evidence with documentation instead of the 3 years that is the minimum requirement for BPSS. It also obviously references checks like directorship searches and the open source internet or social media checks that were introduced as a recommendation rather than specifically part of the current 7858 standards too. So BPSS, it's just the baseline for government employees, all government employees, anybody working in the public sector essentially in the UK. And whilst it does include those 4 key elements, ID verification, right to work checks, criminal records, and the 3 years employment verification, it doesn't have those extra elements. So BPSS is obviously far less comprehensive than 7858, but it does serve as a foundational vetting process for government roles or anyone in that public sector space, contractors and third parties too. So it might sound counterintuitive. Why are we not doing as many checks on the public sector as we are in the security and security environment? Many people, of course, who go through BPSS vetting, they just do that as the initial benchmark, the baseline vetting, before they go on to have higher level of national security vetting checks conducted. This is, of course, done by the NSV, which is a division within the Ministry of Defence, and this is where security clearance or SC, counter-terror checks or CTC checks, and developed vetting or DV come into the picture. So please don't worry, everybody's getting checked to the appropriate level for their specific role within the public sector too. I think that's all of the questions. Thank you very much indeed for posting them. And of course, if you do have any follow-up questions, if you think of something after the webinar has ended, please don't hesitate to reach out. Once the webinar has ended, you'll find contact details on our website, of course, and on our socials. Give us a follow. But that's it for the Q&A section. Questions from the floor. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that brings us to a close. What's next then? In 2 weeks' time, we're going to be covering the Disclosure Scotland evolution. Things are really getting interesting when it comes to criminal record checks north of the border. They are finally embracing the digital revolution in Scotland, and they're doing away with the basic standard and enhanced disclosures. That's just one of the key changes that are coming. So please do register if you want to find out more. All there is to know in just 2 weeks' time. If you'd be so kind, please help spread the word. We really do hope to see you there. So Sarah, thanks ever so much for your kind assistance, and thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks to those of you watching on catch up too as well. Just keep calm and carry on vetting. Thank you and bye-bye.